I came home early because a Boulder vendor canceled at 2:16, and the quiet inside our Cherry Creek condo felt wrong before I understood why. Upstairs, water ran with the steady force of somebody settling in, and then Celeste Brenner laughed from my primary bathroom, soft and careless. I opened the door far enough to see Wyatt Granger in the tub, one arm stretched along the edge, looking completely at home. Celeste sat across from him with wet hair pinned badly, her hand resting where a friend's hand never should have been in my house. They did not see me at first, and that detail made my body go still instead of breaking the way I once imagined. It was not only that my husband was with Celeste, the woman who knew every private, weak place I had trusted her with. It was how normal they looked under my lights, breathing steam scented with eucalyptus oil I had bought the Friday before. Wyatt reached for Celeste's fingers without thinking, and she smiled back like the room had already stopped belonging to me. I stepped away before either of them looked up, because some part of me understood noise would only help them rearrange the story. My hand found the old latch Wyatt had installed years earlier during a plumbing repair, and for 1 second, I almost opened the door. Then I slid it into place, and the small click sounded cleaner than anything I had heard all afternoon. They kept laughing for 2 more breaths, which told me everything their future apologies would try to deny. I walked downstairs without touching the banister too hard, my hands steady in a way that felt almost borrowed from someone colder. On the kitchen island, Wyatt's phone sat face down beside Celeste's, both abandoned like nothing dangerous could ever reach them there. I moved them farther from the stairs, did not open either one, and stood listening to water run above the life I had balanced. The espresso machine, the cracked blue tile, and the linen towel over the oven handle still looked insultingly unchanged beneath my hands. Then Wyatt called my name from upstairs. Not frightened yet, only irritated that the room was no longer obeying him. Celeste followed with, "Marin, open the door," and even through wood. I heard control slipping under the sweetness. I picked up my phone and called Reed Winslow, her husband, before either of them could turn panic into explanation. When Reed answered, I kept my voice even enough to scare myself and said, "Come to my house now. Don't ask me on the phone." Upstairs, Wyatt struck the door once and said my name harder, like volume could still make me the reasonable woman he had used. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the closed hallway while the water kept running behind them. For the first time in my marriage, I understood the lock was not revenge, and it was not rage either. It was evidence. Reed Winslow arrived 12 minutes later, work jacket half-zipped, truck keys in hand, and confusion leaving his face. He looked at me once in the foyer, then up toward Wyatt, hitting the bathroom door harder. "Where is she?" came out quiet, but it carried the weight of a man afraid of the answer. I stepped aside and pointed upstairs, keeping my voice level as I answered. "Behind the door with my husband." Reed's hand closed around his keys until the metal pressed white into his palm, but he did not ask for proof. Above us, Celeste went silent when she heard him, and that silence told him more than any confession could. He took the stairs fast, not messy, like every step still belonged to the life he thought he had. I followed slowly enough to hear Wyatt through the door, saying, "Marin locked us in here. Reed. She's not thinking clearly." I stopped beside Reed and looked at the bathroom door, breathing steam around the frame. "Before I open that door, understand this," I told him, because Wyatt survived by making people react before understanding. What you hear next is not their first mistake. And behind the door, something shifted hard against tile. Celeste tried sweetness too late, whispering, "Reed, please, just tell her to open it." But he kept looking at me. I kept my hand away from the latch, because that was the first power I had held all afternoon. 3 months ago, I found hotel deposits in Vail, coded as bottle label consultation. I said, watching Reed stay still. There was $4,200 marked as a private retreat vendor advance, and Celeste made a sound she could not take back. Wyatt snapped. "This is not the time." But Reed asked, "Did Celeste know about the money?" No one spoke from inside, and the blank space after his question became the cleanest answer either of us received. I slid the latch back, and the click felt louder than knocking because it ended the part they could edit. Steam moved out first, carrying eucalyptus, panic, and the ruined softness of my bathroom. Wyatt stepped forward angry, while Celeste stayed behind him, unable to look directly at Reed. "This is insane," Wyatt started, aiming at me because anger was easier than shame. But Reed never took his eyes off Celeste. "Did you know about the money?" he asked again, and her mouth opened without a sentence ready behind it. Celeste whispered, "Reed, it is not what you think." But she still did not answer. I looked at Wyatt, then toward the stairs, and said, "You can explain the latch after you explain the ledger." In the living room, nobody sat like they belonged there, not even Wyatt, who kept standing near the fireplace in towel-wrapped rage. Celeste took the armchair closest to the hallway, damp hair against her neck, while Reed stayed on the couch with his hands locked together. I pulled the manila folder from the console drawer, and Wyatt looked at it like the affair had finally become expensive. The folder was plain, one corner bent from my work tote, but every page inside had survived longer than their excuses. I set bank statements, QuickBooks exports, vendor emails, and receipt notes across the coffee table, one careful stack at a time. Wyatt muttered, "Marin, don't do this." But Reed was already reading, and Celeste had stopped looking anywhere near the pages. I tapped the first line and said, "Vale, 2 nights, coded as bottle label consultation," while Wyatt shook his head too quickly. "That was business," he said, and I answered, "Then the vendor should remember meeting you." But he didn't. The second page landed harder because the amount was clean, recent, and written in the same category Wyatt used for real events. There was $4,200 marked as a private retreat vendor advance, I said, and Celeste made a small sound before she could stop herself. Reed turned toward her slowly, and his question barely needed breath. "You knew money was moving?" Celeste swallowed and whispered. Wyatt said it was clean, which told me she had known enough to ask. I kept my eyes on Celeste because her answer had moved her from careless friend to willing participant. "With my books, my vendors, and my marriage," I said, and she looked away before the last word landed. Wyatt stepped in fast with, "We can correct the accounting," trying to make fraud sound like a typo in a spreadsheet. "You don't correct betrayal by renaming the column," I answered, and the room went quiet enough to hear the furnace start. I made it clear that Wyatt had asked me to manage those books for years. Not because I had stolen anything. I had not opened their phones, posted anything, hacked anything, or touched one piece of evidence I could not legally explain. Reed reached for the copy closest to him and said, "I need these," without asking Celeste whether she wanted him to know. I handed him the prepared set, and Wyatt finally understood I had not brought anger into that room. I had brought order. That was when his fear changed direction, away from the bathtub and toward the business he thought would protect him. "Who else has seen this?" Wyatt asked, too carefully, like the wrong name could split the floor beneath him. I looked at the folder, then at him, and said, "Laurel Strickland, my attorney," without raising my voice. Celeste closed her eyes. Reed exhaled once, and Wyatt stood there with no clean version left to sell. By Sunday afternoon, Wyatt had stopped asking if I was serious and started watching the folder like it might move without me. Laurel had told me not to throw him out, not to post anything, and not to let anger create a cleaner story for him. so Wyatt slept in the guest room, while I kept the original records secured and the scanned copies where Laurel could access them. Every hour he stayed under my roof felt strange, but every quiet hour also made the paperwork stronger. Wyatt tried privacy first, then shame, then the old husband voice that used to make me explain myself before he ever did. "You are humiliating me," he said Saturday night, standing in the kitchen while I sealed one more envelope. I looked at the label with Pierce Dunham's name on it and answered, "You used the business as a wallet." Wyatt. He flinched at business, not marriage, and that told me exactly where the deepest fear lived. The dinner was not for neighbors, not for gossip, and not for some loud performance Celeste could later call unstable. It was for the people already trapped inside the damage. Wyatt, Celeste, Reed, Pierce, Laurel, and me at one table. I roasted trout, sliced pears for salad, warmed sourdough, and set plates like manners could hold the room together. By 5 o'clock, the food looked calm enough to insult everything waiting behind it. Pierce arrived first, still carrying the tiredness of a man pulled from a Sunday operations issue into somebody else's marriage. He saw Laurel's legal pad on the sideboard and immediately stopped looking at this like a personal favor. "Why am I here, Marin?" he asked, and I slid the thin vendor packet across the entry table. "Because your vendor codes are in the folder," I answered, and his hand tightened before he opened it. Laurel came next, composed in a charcoal coat, with no dramatic warning and no appetite for threats dressed up as justice. She reminded everyone this was private, not a deposition, not a recorded confrontation, and not an excuse to destroy evidence. Celeste arrived in a camel coat, makeup careful, posture smooth, still trying to look like she belonged near my table. Reed followed behind her without touching her back, and that missing touch said more than his face did. We sat down with the roasted trout untouched between us, the salad shining under the dining light, and every glass filled but ignored. I stood at the head of the table, because sitting would have made the evening feel like something we shared. On Tuesday, I found Wyatt and Celeste together in my home. I said, and Celeste dropped her eyes first, "Tonight, that is not the worst thing on this table." Pierce opened the ledger copy before Wyatt could speak, and his expression changed by the second page. "This vendor never handled retreat deposits," he said, looking at Wyatt with the kind of anger that had numbers under it. Wyatt leaned forward fast and said, "Pierce, do not let my marriage infect the business." Pierce did not even blink before answering. "You already infected the business." Laurel placed the divorce filing beside my plate, not in Wyatt's hands yet, just close enough for him to understand timing had left him. "Financial disclosures will happen through counsel," she said, calm enough to make the room colder. "The business review belongs to the company's CPA and attorney, not this dining room." I looked at Wyatt then, and for once, he had to hear the truth without owning the microphone. Laurel slid the divorce packet across the table, and Wyatt did not touch it, because touching it would make the evening real. He stared at the top page like the words might change if he waited long enough, then looked at me with disbelief. "You filed already?" he asked, and I kept both hands still beside my plate when I answered. "Friday morning." His eyes moved from Laurel to Pierce, then back to me, searching for one person still willing to soften what he had done. "I did not plan the betrayal," I said, because Wyatt's face had already started arranging me into the villain. I prepared for the cleanup, and Laurel's silence beside me made the sentence feel even cleaner. Celeste finally lifted her head, eyes wet but careful, and said Wyatt told her our marriage had been dead for years. Reed looked at her without blinking, because the woman using grief at my table still had not explained the money. Celeste kept talking, saying she believed they were building something honest, something separate, something I was too cold to understand. I reached into the folder and placed the email printout beside her untouched wine glass. where everyone could read the sentence. In her own words, Celeste had written that Marin already built the boring part, and the room went quiet around it. Reed read it first, then Pierce. Then Celeste looked away like the paper had spoken louder than I ever could. "You did not want my husband," I said, watching her carefully powdered face lose its practiced softness under the dining light. "You wanted the life you thought I was too tired to defend." And this time, Wyatt did not interrupt me. Pierce picked up the copy and said Wyatt's spending authority was suspended until an outside CPA reviewed the accounts. Wyatt snapped that Pierce could not lock him out of his own company. But Pierce answered, "I can protect the company from you." Laurel spoke only when the room started leaning toward shouting, her voice calm enough to pull everyone back to consequence. Unauthorized business use, misclassified expenses, reimbursement, tax correction, and possible civil claims would be handled by counsel, not by threats. That mattered, because I was not trying to become the prosecutor, the judge, or the story Wyatt could call unstable later. I wanted the truth written cleanly enough that no one could wash it down with Sunday wine. Reed removed his wedding ring and set it on the table. Not dramatically, just firmly enough to end one life. "You made me a witness because you thought I would be too embarrassed to speak," he told Celeste. She reached toward him, but he stepped back with the folder under his arm and the first calm expression I had seen on him all week. Celeste stayed seated, suddenly small inside the expensive coat she had worn like armor. Wyatt turned on me last, because every other door in the room had closed while he was still choosing his argument. "You are enjoying this," he said, and for 1 second I remembered the bathroom latch under my fingers. "No," I answered. With the divorce packet between us and every receipt still breathing on the table, "I am just not carrying it for you anymore." The lock upstairs had not trapped them. Not really, because people like Wyatt and Celeste always believed they could talk their way out. What it trapped was the first clean version of the truth. Before panic, charm, and shame had time to edit it. Now the door was open. The table was full, and every person who mattered had heard the same thing. Wyatt sat in front of the life he spent, and for once, there was nowhere left to hide. After everyone left, I did not clean the table right away, because the untouched trout still looked calmer than the room had been. Laurel took the filed copies. Pierce left with the vendor packet, and Reed walked out without waiting for Celeste to follow. Wyatt stayed seated with the divorce papers open in front of him, staring like the legal font might soften if he waited. When he finally whispered, "Marin, we can still figure something out," I looked at him and answered, "We just did." The house became quiet after that, but it was not the old quiet that made me listen for what I had missed. It was the quiet of plates cooling, wine untouched, and a front door closing on people who could no longer perform innocence. I rinsed each glass slowly, not because I needed chores, but because my hands understood order before my heart did. Wyatt slept in the guest room that night, and by morning, even his footsteps sounded temporary against the hallway floor. He moved out within 2 weeks, first calling it space, then calling it necessary, then stopping before he named it defeat. The divorce moved through mediation with Laurel keeping every number clean, every disclosure documented, and every emotional argument away from the settlement table. I kept the condo because the payment history, account records, and refinance approval all said what Wyatt never had to say. He reimbursed part of the misused money, and the business review took care of the rest without needing my anger. Pierce kept the tasting room alive, but not the version Wyatt had built around his own charm and everybody else's labor. Outside, controls came in. The CPA corrected the books, and Wyatt's buyout reflected the damage he created before he understood it had a price. Celeste's retreat never launched, not because anyone screamed online, but because upscale circles punish quietly when trust starts smelling expensive. Reed divorced her cleanly, And the last I heard, her client stopped answering with the same silence she once gave him. Months later, I opened Calder Ledger House from a small office near Cherry Creek, helping women-owned restaurants clean books before men like Wyatt touched them. The first morning, I stood on my balcony with coffee, while thin snow melted across parked cars below me. I did not feel victorious, and I did not miss the applause some people expect after surviving humiliation. Peace did not arrive like applause. It arrived like a quiet room where nobody was lying to me. Thank you for staying with Marin's story until the end, and hearing the quiet parts most people miss. If her strength, silence, or new beginning felt familiar, share your thoughts below. Sometimes peace does not begin when someone chooses you. Sometimes it begins when you finally choose yourself.